Welcome to this education video on Cyrex Array 11 Chemical Immune Reactivity Screen. I'm Robyn Puglia. I'm the head of clinical education for Cyrex Labs, and I am a clinical consultant for Regeneris Labs, who are the distributor for Cyrex for the UK, Europe, and Ireland. So chemical immune reactivity screen is part of our assessment of the environmental drivers of immune system dysregulation, which is one of the hallmarks, of course, of autoimmune disease. So we know that to develop an autoimmune disease, it is considered necessary to have three important variables. So genetic predisposition, which does actually play a role in how our immune system is going to tolerate or create inflammatory responses to environmental exposure to chemicals. Barrier permeability, disrupted by environmental chemicals, and the three categories of environmental trigger, which is foods, infections, and toxins. So of course, when we're talking about toxins in the context of biotransformation and elimination, we have both endogenous and exogenous exposures to waste products and toxic metabolites and toxic products. But in the context of the immune system, the exposome is the individual's lifetime exposure to a variety of external and internal factors. So we're thinking about all of the different exposures for the immune system that have the ability to influence or affect immune communication or the way the immune system learns about the environment, which includes the internal environment and the external environment. So the study that taught us that there are more than 200 different chemicals in the cord blood of a newborn was actually more than 20 years ago. So, and I mention that because, of course, the exposure happens really from all the way through from when the mother was in utero, right? So we know that the environment has the ability to influence the egg inside the fetus of a pregnant mother. So everything from then on has the ability to affect not just epigenetics, but also to inform the immune system, lastly, to accumulate in the body. So all humans are exposed to synthetic pollutants, and in fact, the number increases alarmingly year on year. So what was true 20 years ago is actually amplified now. And what was true in our grandparents' childhoods is actually no longer true about the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water that we bathe in. And some of these chemicals that we're exposed to in growing numbers every year have the ability to resist metabolism. They're not broken down very easily by the body. They are not excreted very easily by the body. And therefore, they accumulate in the tissues of the body. They accumulate in bone, in fatty tissue, in the brain. And so from that 200 plus chemicals that we are born with, from the moment we're born, we are continuing to accumulate small amounts, hopefully, of a large and wide number of different types of environmental chemical, and this is called body burden. So body burden is part of the exposome. It is specifically the toxic chemical or the an exogenous chemical component of the exposome. And in fact, there are multiple components of body burden that have the ability to affect the immune barriers of the body, oxidative stress, inflammation, in addition to what we're going to be talking about today, which is immune tolerance of the chemicals found inside the body burden. So the general population's body burden actually indicates that even very small releases of persistent bioaccumulative substances can build to really significant levels over time. And of course, there is some unique susceptibility. The unique genetics, the unique exposures means that some people can be extremely affected by a small amount of exposure in a relatively small amount of time. And for other people, they have more resilience and more robust responses to the bioaccumulation of chemicals and exposures. But what is true for all of us is that you don't have to be in a toxic environment per se. You do not have to be a firefighter. You do not have to work in a chemical plant to have a very significant exposure to chemicals. This test, again, 23 years ago at time of making this video, discovered 167 chemical pollutants in blood and urine, including an average of 53 carcinogens in each person. This is a very small study with only 9 people, but very significant that the people in the study did not work with chemicals and they did not live near industrial facilities. And in fact, in Cyrex Array 11, the chemicals that we're measuring immune response to are not industrial chemicals per se. They are the ones that are in our homes, in our clothes, in our food, in our bodies. You don't actually have to go very far for an exposure to these chemicals because they are the ones that we are all exposed to on a daily basis. So, an important aspect of understanding the role of environmental chemicals in autoimmune disease and in immune system perturbation generally is the understanding that exposure to chemicals has the ability to create barrier permeability. So this study really specifically looked at airborne particulate matter, and what they found was that in fact airborne particulate matter inhaled through the respiratory tract has the ability to increase gut permeability. And so when we're taking in chemicals from the air, through our skin, or through our food, or any of the other ways that we have exposures to environmental chemicals, what we know is that it affects the microbiome globally, but also has the ability to create barrier permeability on all of our immune barriers, all of our mucosal surfaces. So intestinal permeability, lung and respiratory tract permeability, blood-brain barrier permeability. So in addition to being one of the 3 variables of in that they are an environmental trigger, chemicals and pollutant exposure also create a significant amount of one of those other circles in the Venn diagram, which is immune system, aberrant immune responses associated with barrier permeability and changes on the mucosal immune surfaces. Which of course is incredibly relevant when we are trying to understand how to make accurate, appropriate clinical interventions. It is also really important to understand when we're working with how the intersection between the environment and the immune system, that whilst I've talked about body burden is incredibly important, that it isn't as relevant in the context of immune response. If you have lost tolerance to a specific environmental chemical or an environmental exposure, it doesn't take a large amount of that exposure to create a very significant inflammatory response. So when we're working in clinical practice, we need to be thinking about both of those things. We need to be thinking about body burden and understanding not just the total body burden, but also how what the makeup of the body burden is and how those chemicals interact with each other, because we know that in this context, 1 + 1 does not equal 10. When we're adding lead and mercury together in the body, the impact of the total is significantly greater than the sum of the individual parts. So 1 + 1 equals 10 in that specific situation. So understanding how the accumulation of the different chemicals affects inflammation, oxidative stress, and body burden is an important part of understanding how to work with the immune system. But in addition, understanding tolerance also helps us to understand very specifically where to begin the work of reducing environmental exposure, reducing body burden, and detoxification. So chemicals, what we're looking to understand here is something specific called haptenation, right? So haptenation is one of the mechanisms through which chemicals can directly drive the autoimmune process, where in addition to just being part of the exposure, part of the accumulation of the body burden in tissue, the chemicals themselves can actually bind to proteins in the body. The chemical and the protein bound together is called the Hapten carrier adduct, and this is a neoantigen. So the body can then recognize this as being non-self, even though it is our own tissue. It's no longer recognizable as self tissue, and set up autoantibodies to that tissue. So if you have chemical bound to thyroid, you will have thyroid autoantibodies. If you have chemical bound to neurological tissue, you will have neurological autoantibodies. So we're looking to understand using albumin if this is occurring and which chemical specifically is driving this process, to better understand the immune relationship, not just with the chemical itself, but with these Hapten carrier adducts as part of the autoimmune process. So we're moving beyond measuring toxin levels to assessing the immune involvement in driving inflammatory and just, tissue destructive processes in response to the exposure to these chemicals in the environment. So I have touched on the fact that that there is an aspect of unique susceptibility to environmental exposure. So in this specific example, we're looking at auto service and repair, which of course is an incredibly toxic environment. There is a significant amount of petrochemicals and oils and solvents used in this environment. So not just coming into contact with the skin, but also being inhaled on a daily basis. And we do see a wide range of people working in, for example, beauty salons and hair salons and all manner of environments where they are inhaling solvents and glues, adhesives, and paints. Home renovation, for example, is an incredibly toxic environment, not just for the people who are working in the tradesmen who are working in the building, but also for the families who are living in the homes that are newly renovated or during the renovation process. But the unique susceptibility to exposure teaches us that some people can be exposed to significant burden and in fact remain healthy, not have any significant long-lasting inflammatory consequences to that. Some will have a susceptibility to going on to develop autoimmunity, loss of tolerance, adaptive immune dysregulation, which might be allergies, might be autoimmunity. And then for others, this may end up really down the sort of carcinogenic cancer pathway. Autoimmune disease now affects up to 23.5 million Americans. And in fact, for the UK, the 19 most prevalent autoimmune diseases affect 1 in 10 people in the UK, 10% of the population. So again, my point here is not whether or not the person that you're working with has exposure. They do have exposure. It is how is their body burden involved in immune system dysregulation and specifically driving autoimmune disease or adaptive immune dysregulation. So here we really see what I was talking about with haptenation. So the process through which we create autoantibodies in response to chemicals is where we see the chemical or the chemical metabolite bound to human tissue. This then creates this parent compound, this neoantigen of the hapten, the chemical, and the carrier adduct bound together. However, this is no longer recognizable as self. So now we're going to be we're having stranger danger responses to our own tissue because it is wearing a chemical like a disguise. This then sets up an antibody response over time, and now we're making autoantibodies to that tissue. And this is one of the very well described, very well understood initiating mechanisms of autoimmune disease. So there is a critical distinction of antibodies versus chemicals. Both are problematic. But when we're talking about autoimmune disease, understanding that when you reduce body burden, that will have a long-term effect on inflammation and oxidative stress. If you have lost tolerance to that chemical, even in a period of time, a small exposure can lead to a significant inflammatory response or even potentially trigger a flare of the autoimmune disease. So understanding the antibody involvement in chemical exposure or to the body burden is a distinction when you're working with immune-mediated chronic illness. So additionally, toxicant-induced loss of tolerance can directly lead to loss of tolerance in other areas. So loss of immune tolerance to the chemical burden of the body, but also to chemical exposure in the environment, is actually a fairly well understood mechanism of multiple different chronic illnesses. This is very well described for ME and chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, people with multiple chemical sensitivities, but understanding that when we have this loss of chemical tolerance, that this can drive loss of oral tolerance to foods, loss of self-tolerance to our own tissue. And so when we're working with complex chronic illness or autoimmune disease, understanding when we have loss of tolerance in one area helps us understand that we need to be investigating those other areas as well to see what dominoes have fallen as a result of loss of tolerance here. And in fact, what I would say to you is because of the impact of environmental chemicals and body burden on the microbiomes, on the mucosal and immune barriers, and the assessment of the immune relationship with chemicals is a very important part of really understanding the full clinical picture of what is going on with the immune system of the person that you're working with. And it really helps you to understand if you are working with somebody with multiple food reactions or even polyreactivity, it might be loss of chemical tolerance that is a direct contributing factor to the loss of oral tolerance to foods. And so healing a leaky gut, which is what so many of us are taught will reverse food reactions, isn't going to be effective for that person because the phone call is coming from inside the house. It is loss of chemical tolerance that has led to loss of oral tolerance to the foods, not intestinal permeability for this person. It's why one of the things that I've learned from working with Cyrex for so many years is that really, while we can make educated clinical decisions without testing, we really can't guess what is going on for everybody's immune system. There are so many people where there is a unique combination of environmental drivers and so testing, not guessing, helps us to make accurate, appropriate clinical decisions. Again, here we have, I think I've actually probably explained this significantly, but exposure to environmental chemicals and xenobiotics combined with genetic factors. So the genetics involved in chemical reactivity include not just the speed at which our phase 1 and phase 2 pathways have the ability to biotransform and eliminate exposures from the body or wastes from inside the body, but also will determine inflammatory and oxidative degree as a result of those exposures. When somebody doesn't biotransform particularly well or doesn't eliminate particularly well, and they also have SNPs or genes that predispose to aggressive oxidative responses or poor antioxidant balance or aggressive inflammatory responses to oxidation, just for example, then for the genetically susceptible person, even small exposures can lead to really significant systemic inflammatory responses. In addition to that, of course, the chemical can be creating this parent compound where creating these neoantigen metabolites. This can lead to systemic inflammatory responses and systemic activation of T cells, macrophages, B cells, both the innate and the adaptive immune system involved, and over time directly leading to not just autoimmune disease, but also significant systemic inflammatory reactions. So the 12 chemicals that we're including in Array 11 um, are aflatoxin, formaldehyde and glutaraldehyde, isocyanate, trimellitic and phthalic anhydrides, benzene ring compounds, bisphenol A and bisphenol A binding protein, tetrabromal bisphenol A. So we're doing a really comprehensive assessment of the immune response to um, plastics and plasticizers, tetrachloroethylene, which is found in dry cleaning products, the dry cleaning process, but also in water contamination, parabens from our personal care products and beauty products, mercury compounds, and additionally mixed heavy metals. And again, these are all found in all of our bodies already. None of these are unusual. These are all the ones that are um, representative of daily life, even if you live in a relatively clean environment. So, who are we thinking about RA11 for? Anybody with an autoimmune disease, right? We really want to be thinking about foods, infections, and toxins because they are the environmental drivers of autoimmune disease. If somebody has a diagnosed autoimmune disease, or if they have a strong family history or are in a strong risk group for autoimmunity. So, part of the initial comprehensive workup for somebody with autoimmune disease really should include an assessment of their chemical immune relationship. Any unexplained chronic inflammation, anybody with chemical sensitivities or multiple chemical sensitivity or loss of tolerance to chemicals, anybody with loss of immune tolerance, which includes significantly poor oral tolerance to foods, but also, of course, loss of self-tolerance, and the spectrum of neurological symptoms. Anybody that has neurological inflammation of any kind, many chemicals can cross the blood-brain barrier, but remember that chemical exposures can also create blood-brain barrier permeability. So we are thinking about some occupational exposures, healthcare workers, dental professionals, in fact, people that work in hospitals and medical clinics have a significantly higher body burden than just the average Joe on the street. So understanding that when we're working in sterile environments, that the chemicals required for sterility and for cleanup, in fact, create significant exposure on a daily basis. Dental professionals, construction workers. I would actually include interior decorators in that. Auto mechanics, manufacturing, agriculture, nail salons and hair salons. And also people who have a lot of, that's the beauty addicts, right? So not just the workers, but also the people who are having their nails and hair done frequently. Some special populations, women with fertility issues, endometriosis, PCOS, anybody that has endocrine dysfunction that may be driven by endocrine disrupting chemicals, and then people who are just not responding to standard autoimmune protocols. If you've done an assessment of infections and foods, but you're still not getting the results that you think you should be getting, then environmental chemicals is the final piece of the puzzle there. And then how does Array 11 guide our clinical intervention? Because we always need to be thinking about how is this going to inform what I do next in my clinical practice? So it allows us to provide targeted patient education that is less overwhelming. When we start to think about all of the ways that we are exposed to chemicals in the home, and we start to talk about what's going on in the kitchen, in personal care products, in the sofas, in the clothing, in the air, in the paint, it can feel very, very alarming and overwhelming. So understanding which specific chemicals we need to prioritize helps us to really streamline and focus in on a um, more specific, manageable uh, intervention strategy that isn't going to be overwhelming for the person that you're working with. And then that helps them to review their home, their work, their personal care environment, and all of those other factors, really just for what is the next step that they need to take instead of all of the chemicals that might be involved here. And driving, of course, this allows us to support environmental cleanup to reduce not just current exposures, but also to be aware of future exposures as well. It allows us to understand whether or not we need to be supporting and optimizing detoxification, including not just glutathione, but also the NRF2 pathway and other endogenous antioxidants, whether or not we need to be thinking about phase 1 and phase 2, genetics around detoxification efficacy. Maybe considering binders if that's appropriate. It helps us to understand if we need to assess and address the immune barriers of the body. We might need to be thinking about modulating immune response in the context of chemical burden. And of course, it helps us to monitor progress. It allows us to a baseline, but also to check improvement of and reduction in body burden. So environmental chemicals are capable of triggering autoimmune disease in susceptible individuals. So in addition to Array11, Array11 actually fits into the suite of Cyrex tests that helps us to assess not just whether or not chemicals are part of the adaptive immune responses for this individual, but also how that fits into our comprehensive assessment, whether or not we need to be thinking about autoantibodies, barrier permeability, or loss of tolerance in other areas. So it really integrates with the other Cyrex arrays to map out the autoimmune cascade. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope that this has been clinically useful for you.